For the Roman Empire to expand and maintain its colonial outposts, paved roads had to be built and rivers crossed. The many skills developed by Roman engineers were truly outstanding. This aqueduct in southern France was built in 19 BC. It carried water from a source 50 kilometers or 30 miles away. Roman engineers perfected the arch to create lightweight yet very strong buildings. The stone channels carried a large volume of water to storage tanks within each Roman town. These tanks were domed, and often 3 were built alongside each other. From here, the water was circulated to public baths and to many fountains throughout the city. Here's an artist's impression of the Roman sewerage system. As you can see, it depended on a vast supply of water. The aqueducts provided all that water. Some of those ancient sewers are still being used today. All these skills made it possible for the Romans to establish large towns throughout the empire. Here's a street plan of Pompeii. The grid-like pattern, inherited from the Greeks, was typical of many Roman towns. Although Pompeii was totally buried in the volcanic eruptions of 79 AD, the thick layers of pumice and ash actually helped to preserve many details of life in that ancient Roman town. We know, for instance, that most of the streets had sidewalks, and some roads could be crossed on blocks of stone, very useful on rainy days. The stones were set apart to allow room for chariot wheels, wheels which long ago made these grooves in the stone surface. Legend has it that sometime about 754 BC, the founders of Rome built a settlement on the Palatine Hill. Later on, in the days of the empire, this hill became the site for many extravagant palaces. By the 1st century AD, an imperial palace was established here. It extended along the slope of the hill and up to the summit, with halls, stairways, rooms and fountains, porticos and terraces. It was, to quote a poet of that time, among the most beautiful things in the world. But now, it's been stripped of its marble facade. The Villa Adriana, near Rome, was designed by Emperor Hadrian around 130 AD. It covered a huge area, with an imperial palace, baths, libraries, and large gardens dotted with works of art, all inspired by the buildings and gardens he had seen in his travels throughout the empire. This decorated pool recalls his visit to Egypt. Notice the crocodile on the right. And here, enclosed by circular walls, Emperor Hadrian built his own island retreat. It could be reached by a movable bridge. Of course, most people in Rome didn't live in palaces. Ordinary families lived in blocks of flats or apartments. These were often unsafe, for the owners built on extra stories to house an ever-increasing population. Fires were frequent. This is a street in Herculaneum, another town that was buried in the volcanic eruptions of 79 AD. Smaller towns, such as Herculaneum, offered accommodation that was more comfortable than the unsafe garrets of Rome. Houses like this one probably belonged to a wealthy merchant or businessman. But the architect must have been far ahead of his time, for no one before had used timber framing. The Roman house was built symmetrically, with the atrium, the formal living room, in the center of the house. As larger houses became fashionable, extensions were built, and the atrium became the entrance hall or reception area. The atrium had an opening in the roof, necessary to let in light and air. When it rained, the water was collected in a pool on the floor. The courtyard in a typical Roman house was called the peristyle, an open area onto which many of the rooms faced. It was lined with columns, landscaped, and often contained fountains and statues. Larger houses often had several peristyles. These courtyards, with access from many rooms, gave the house a feeling of spaciousness. The other rooms grouped around the atrium and the peristyle were bedrooms, a dining room, and a study for the master of the house. The inside of a house was more important to the Romans than its appearance from the outside. Houses of wealthy Romans were decorated with paintings or stucco reliefs, often scenes from Greek mythology. Mosaics were very popular in ancient Rome. Floors, walls, and fountains were covered with many spectacular patterns. This mosaic of street musicians shows how Roman artists used special techniques of glazing and shading to create a sense of depth in their work. On the floor of a house in Pompeii, archaeologists uncovered this mosaic. It depicts the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, a great battle between the Greek-Macedonian army of Alexander the Great and the Persian army under Darius. Darius flees in his chariot, while the victorious Alexander gives chase on horseback. Many Roman mosaics reflect a keen interest in the natural world. Animals were observed closely and reproduced realistically. Roman frescoes have also been greatly admired. One 19th century architect was so moved by Roman painting that he wrote down his impressions in a letter. I admit that I didn't have the faintest idea of these admirable works of art. There are landscapes, some of which have been made very skillfully. The trees have been well drawn and colored, the leaves painted very elegantly, with very limited means. There is a young Achilles who is being taught by the centaur Chiron to play a musical instrument. The motion is simple, natural, and absolutely unforced. The faces express a majesty and lofty sadness which touch one profoundly. I have seen it. I have seen it with my own eyes. The old art of painting was practiced with infinitely more comprehension than the dreary imitations of antiquity which have revolted and horrified us. We can only be grateful that these unique works of ancient art have been saved, for they give us some idea of the skills developed by artists, engineers, and architects in ancient Rome. Their skills, in fact, helped to create the urban lifestyle that we know today.